So what is stopping the zone or this peak performance state from taking place? Again, there's a universal aspect and a subjective aspect that we got to uncover. The universal aspect is stress. Stress is the number one killer of performance. It doesn't matter if it's on the golf course, it could be for public speaking, test taking anxiety, but stress is the biggest killer. And if we can learn how to help players get the stress out of their game, they're going to find their performance really starting to become a lot more consistent. So why is stress the big performance killer universally? Because as you can see here on this slide, it's going to negatively affect your body. So there's a lot of physical symptoms that it produces. It negatively affects your mind that we're going to talk into, and specifically, what are those shifts that are taking place? And most importantly, it negatively affects a player's golf swing. So we're going to talk about how that hormonal release from the fight or flight response is actually the thing that's breaking down the motion. So as we dive into some of the physical effects, these are the real known things that people experience: increased heart rate, muscle shaking, muscular tension, and so on. Interesting enough, though, the heart rate increasing as a physical effect is something that will alter motor function. So it will impact the golf swing if the heart rate gets too high. But many people are aware of these physical effects. I mean, the list can go on and on. And again, this is a red flag or an indicator that the brain is in stress in some level, and you're going to see the impact here in a moment. The next thing that the stress is impacting is mental. So as we dive in through the personality type, what we're able to see is that there are four main things that stress is affecting players mentally. The first is how they're directing and using their mental energy. There's a shift there on the golf course. The focus changes and what information you're paying attention to, where a player's focus is going. All these things are being altered naturally with stress. Making decisions and evaluating situations. I mean, I can't tell you how many countless times I've made poor decisions under stress because we're starting to see things from a whole different perspective. And believe it or not, the way we approach achieving our goals is also impacted by the cortisol release or this fight or flight. And we're going to dive into these shifts that are very predictable today. Also, here are some of the effects on the golf swing. So this is what's been frustrating golfers for a long time. They put in a lot of work on their game, and yet when they go to the course, they're not getting the same thing they're seeing in practice. And why is that? When stress is impacting the mind, it's impacting the player's motor cortex. So when the brain fires off fight or flight, there is a couple hormones going off in the brain and chemicals being released, mainly cortisol and adrenaline. Now, cortisol acts as a paralytic, so it's there clamping down on the motor cortex. And depending on how much cortisol is going on will determine how big of an impairment in those motor functions a player will find. So as you can see, stress inhibits motor cortex. It inhibits the firing of the motor programs. So this is what people have quote unquote called muscle memory. But it isn't the muscles that have memory. It's the developed motor programs that can fire seamless. So under stress, these motor programs are being suppressed. Coordination in the body, synchronistic muscle movements, fine motor skills and muscle movement, and the sequencing and timing get thrown off, all as a result of stress. So when you're looking at performance breakdowns or breakdowns in technique out on the golf course, if a player is hitting it well on the range, but they're not able to get and take it to the golf course, it usually isn't a swing issue. It is a stress issue. And on this next slide, you can see that stress is what causes breakdown. So I have two images here. The first one on the left is a person walking on a casual balance beam. So think about if you were to ask to walk across that same beam, how easy it would be for you to do. You would be able to walk across it. You'd probably get good at it, could turn around on it, walk backwards, but there's no consequence. And so the body is able to walk freely. There's no suppression of the motor cortex. However, if we took that same balance beam and we raised it across two buildings like the image on the right, how different would it be to walk across that same board? Now, as we add in a consequence, the fear, the threat of a consequence in this situation, it fires off that fight or flight. And most people would struggle to even get anything near that beam. And as soon as you brought them back down to ground level, the walking would come right back. This is what's happening to a lot of players on the golf course, and they don't even know it. On the course or the range, it's casual. There's no consequence, no fear, no stress. So the motor cortex is able to operate freely. They're able to get the most out of their technique that they've been working on. However, when they go to the course and there's now a perceived threat or a perceived consequence, the brain fires off the same mechanisms as if you were walking across that beam. It fires off the fight or flight, even to an imagined or a made-up threat inside of the mind, like even looking foolish. This can create a cortisol release. And again, that cortisol release is going to clamp down on the motor cortex, and the technique is just not going to be as fluid. If it's really extreme, they're really fearful, it could shut down altogether. And it's not uncommon for players to sometimes come off the course and say, well, it felt like I didn't even know how to play the game or know how to swing a club. And so why is this flown under the radar for so long? It's because most stress that people get is acute that they think about. When they think of stress, they think of the acute forms. So obviously, if you're on the 72nd hole of a big event and it's coming down to that putt in order to win, we know our bodies are reacting. I mean, the heart's pounding through the chest, might be tight, might be shaking a little bit, breathing's changing. And during those big moments, stress is obvious. We know we have to attend to it. And so players do, and they do their best to control their breathing and whatever they've been taught by their coaches. But that isn't the most impactful way that stress is hurting and hampering performance out there. Stress is impacting most players under the radar. And this is true in life. Most people are struggling with stress, and they're what we call the boiled frog syndrome. And medical professionals will agree with this. They say about 85% root cause of illness and disease is stress. It's all because stress, most of it is hidden, and it's under that radar. So the boiled frog, we use this weird analogy to explain the point. If you were to take a frog and throw it into boiling hot water, it would immediately recognize the heat and jump out. This is those acute forms of stress on the golf course. But if you put a frog in lukewarm water and you slowly turned up the heat, the frog wouldn't detect the changes, and eventually they would end up boiling in the hot water. And this is what's happening under the surface in most players' game. They are unaware that there is stress that's impacting their golf game, and they're unaware of these ways that it's showing up. So they hit it good on the range, they go to the course, struggle, go back to the range, the consequences released, and suddenly the motion comes back. Motion doesn't break down that quickly. It takes a long time to change motion, as most of you know, working on golf swings. And so the golf swing can't be breaking down like motion-wise from that walk from the range to the first tee. It's the changes inside and the changes in perception and focus and the things we'll go through that are indicating that stress is happening. And oftentimes players are going out and doing things that they've been taught that are going against their natural way and creating stress. And it's one of the reasons why they're underperforming. They run to the range, it's right back, and they never make that link. So believe it or not, though, as we start looking at the subjective side of stress, your stress responses and the way you're responding is predictable. It's actually based on your personality type. And so as we start looking at stress from this lens, it's really easy to see these changes that players are making on the course. It's quite startling, actually. As we interviewed players from all around the world with different levels, they all were coming back with very, very similar responses. So most of us are born knowing with the idea that we are right-handed or left-handed. We have that knowledge built into us that one is dominant and one is inferior. For me, I was born a right-handed person, and I never picked that. For whatever reason, some box was checked in my mind to say I was a righty, and I always went to do this more naturally than using my left. So obviously, you can learn to develop your left hand. So in sports, I was a right-handed player in basketball. Throw me a ball, I naturally dribble with my right hand. But to be good, I had to learn and develop my left. But even as I developed my left hand, really proficient with it, it was never as dominant. It's always going to be inferior and will require more work if I'm using that hand. And there's a great little exercise you could do right now if you have a piece of pen and paper. Take your dominant hand and just sign your name as you normally would. And notice how smooth and effortless that performance is, how little thought needs to go into it. Now take that pen and put it into your left hand or your inferior hand and try to trace over what you just did. And notice how much more effort goes into it, how much thought, how much more energy that you have to put into it only to produce a mediocre result. And this is what takes place oftentimes with people mentally, because Most of us are never been taught throughout our life that we have innate mental preferences built into our brain, and it is set up similar to our handedness. We have both, but one is dominant and one is going to be inferior. And these tendencies will stay with us through our whole life, just like with your handedness. So the four main facets that we all have built into our brain are our use of energy. So we all have an internal battery that when it's maxed out, we get the most out of ourselves and it's running more effectively. We have our ability to focus. And believe it or not, there are two different ways as we focus, as we'll go through it. We have an evaluation facet built into our mind. This is our decision-making facet, or how we're arriving at good decisions. Again, there's a dominant and inferior. And also the way we structure out our time or prioritize our life to get things done. And there are two ways, believe it or not, that we go about approaching our goals. And so as you look at these four mental facets and our eight are the two preferences, when you do all the combinations, it's going to form 16 different mental golf types. Now, this is all based off Jungian psychology that's been around since 1921. And Jung started discovering some of the human template that's under the surface. And why this is so important to understand this is really our unconscious mind. It is built in, it's innate, and it will not change. So we have to learn to work within this. And why this is important, it's the very first filter our brains are processing information through. So at that root level, the first thing our brains process is, am I comfortable or am I stressed? And based on our personality types, you're going to see that these are linked, that our stress response can be predictable as well as our natural dominant strengths.